Okay, pressing live. All right, so I think we are officially live. All right. All right, inshallah, let's get started. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everybody. Welcome to our usual Embrace Wednesday discussion. Every Wednesday, we have been discussing and talking about the book from Dr. Bilal Phillips, Evolution of Fiqh. Tonight, we'll be going over section 3 of this book, titled The Third Stage Building, in reference to further building the science of fiqh. And last week, we discussed the evolution of fiqh and the development of fiqh during the time of the Rashidin, or the 4 rightly guided caliphs. But before we jump into the 3rd chapter, which, just like last year, is a very short chapter, only a few pages, but there are also some very important key moments mentioned in this chapter that we need to discuss. I just wanted to kind of go over again some of the terms that we learned for the past few sessions, just to make sure that everyone's keeping up and we're not getting lost. It's been brought to my attention that this topic can be a pretty heavy topic, especially for those who are beginners. So I just want to make sure we're all staying on the same page. And if I say anything that anyone has a question about, please don't be afraid to ask. But so let's go. Let's just quickly go ahead and go over a few key terms that will again be mentioned in this chapter as well in regards to fiqh. So first, some of the terms that we've learned, of course, is the difference between fiqh and the difference between sharia. Can someone here remind us or know the answer of the difference between fiqh and difference between fiqh and sharia? Both are typically defined as Islamic law. What are the differences between fiqh and sharia we've discussed?
Other ways of doing things. Fiqh is the extraction of rulings from Quran and Sunnah and other Muslim.
Brother Hassi, I think Brother Daniel had also wanted to answer. He had his hand up, so I just want to give him that courtesy. You wanted to answer? Or if you don't, you can ask Brother Hasib to continue his explanation.
Yeah, Brother Hasib got the first half, and then fiqh is just application or understanding of the religion for things that are not, that we have to come to a ruling or an understanding as to proper ways of defining the ruling for that. Sorry if that's badly worded.
No, you're definitely on the right track. Fiqh is essentially the science or understanding of Islamic law, deriving rulings of Islamic law based off the source. The source, of course, being the Sharia. So the Sharia is the source of Islamic law, being, of course, the Quran and the Sunnah, the way of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessings be upon him. And fiqh is more of like the application and understanding of that source and applying laws based off of that source. And so we discussed the difference between fiqh and sharia, and we also went over a few terms along the way. So who here can remind me the meaning of the term ijtihad? We talked about this term last week, ijtihad. All right, no problem. So just as a reminder for all of us, the term ijtihad essentially means making a reasoned, dictating a ruling, an independent ruling based off your own understanding and based off what you understand from the Quran and the Sunnah. So, for example, if an issue is not specifically mentioned or defined in the Quran or the Sunnah, someone makes a ruling based off their own understanding and their own rationality of what is available from the Quran and the Sunnah. Also discuss that this practice of in making independent rulings is not something that just anyone can do. Just like with any type of science, it has to be done by those who are trained and have the education to do such a practice. This is not something that just, for example, myself or any hoo-ha out on the street can just start interpreting the religion based off their own wants and desires. It's done by those who have that proper practice and understanding. So when we went over ijtihad last week, we all went over the word ijma'a, which essentially basically means consensus, coming to a consensus based in fiqh, based off of discussion and understanding from a shura, with shura being a consultation. And so we discussed these different terms last week in regards to how fiqh was starting to be applied during the times of the Rashidin, or the rightly guided caliphs. And during that time, of course, there were really not many religious divisions, right? There were like all these different schools of thought. It was all under one, for the most part, one particular ruling, the ruling of the caliph, mainly because, of course, all the Sahaba and the companions were together, and the caliphs at that time were respected and also properly implemented the understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah. But we're going now into the time after the rightly guided caliphs, when Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet ﷺ's cousin, who was the fourth and final of the rightly guided caliphs, was assassinated. The time came for the rise of the Umayyad dynasty. And we're not going to go into vivid detail of the Islamic history, because of course we don't want to bore anyone, nor do we want to go outside of what we're talking about. But just a few key points in regards to this period that which contributed to the further development of the madhahib, the schools of thought, and fiqh of itself. So during the rising of the Umayyad dynasty was also the decline or the fall of the practice of assigning somebody to be the Khalifa based off of consensus. It became essentially a monarchy in a way. So what I mean by that is during the rise of the Umayyad dynasty, before the Umayyads, when someone was given the position of Khalifa, it was not based off, it was not something that you inherited, right? To be put into the position of being the leader of the of the Islamic State, it was not something that you were born into or inherited. It was mainly due through a consensus from a group of individuals or from the previous caliph, right? Almost the best way I can describe it was almost like a democracy in a particular way. But when Muawiyah, who was the first in the Umayyad dynasty, came to power, things shifted, right? So individuals started being put into positions of power based off their birthright in a way. So it became somewhat of a monarchy. And so people were put in the position of Khalifa based off of their blood in relation to the previous caliph. So it became a monarchy. And on top of that, a lot of corruption and political and social unrest developed within the Muslim Ummah, the Muslim nation. And due to this, someone has the chat. No problem, Mr. Tal. Don't worry about that. We're just happy to have you with us. Jazakallah khair. May Allah reward you with good. But as I was saying, we'll quickly move on. So, and we're not going to go into, like I said, vivid detail about this particular period because it'd be a very long conversation. And on top of that, I don't want anyone to get too lost, right? So, just a few key points during the Umayyad dynasty. Number one is there was a lot of political unrest and corruption during this time, and it caused a lot of division within the Muslim Ummah, the Islamic nation. A lot of political factions came to rise during this time, a little bit earlier during this time. Just two I want to quickly note that's mentioned in the book, the Khawarij and the Shi'as. The Khawarij are essentially, think of them as the first ISIS. That's probably the best way to describe the Khawarij. They were a group of extremists that essentially had the identity of, my way or the highway. If you didn't follow this particular understanding of Islam, you were considered a kafir, and they would kill you off. So they were basically the first extremist group in Islam in a particular way. And the Shi'as, and this is actually a very interesting fact that I don't know if everyone knows, originally the Shi'as were not a religious faction, they were a political faction. There was not always large religious differences between mainstream Islam and Shi'ism. It was originally at first a political division. But then, of course, over time, it's evolved into an actual different religious faction of Islam. Before it was political. So all these different political divisions were coming to rise, and the Muslim and the Islamic nation was finding themselves divided, and a lot of people were fighting for power, right? And on top of that, the caliphs at that time that were responsible had a lot of corruption. They were implementing a lot of practices that went against Islam, and this caused a lot of the previous scholars and the companions who were working with the Islamic government before the fall of the four rightly guided caliphs to essentially take a step back. So there was no longer a ijma in a way. There was no longer a consensus with the Islamic State between the scholars and the Islamic State anymore at this time, because essentially with any of the major scholars and the commands at that time would speak up against the caliph, they would be, of course, persecuted. So this caused a lot of the major scholars who were students of these different companions to kind of all disperse, separate, and basically take a step back from the caliphs. And so before I move on, are there any questions or any discrepancies that anyone wants to say that we've mentioned so far? Or have I lost anybody? Because I know this topic is a little bit of a heavy topic. I want to make sure I'm not losing anybody.
I have one observation, and that one is that Shia is a part of mainstream Islam. Throughout the last 1400 years, the majority of scholars, they all are in opinion that Shia are part of Muslim community and they are Muslim. So, they are the other extreme, but the balanced view is that the Shia faction is also part of one shade of Islam, and there are some differences here and there, but the mainstream Shia has the same aqidah as Ahlul Sunnah.
Right. No, that's
You know,
a good point. And I wasn't trying to say that all um, people who are Shia are deviant or anything of that nature. But the fact of the matter is, right now, it's generally under it's a general consensus of of people, which of course is not always definitely 100% true. But typically, what do you have people always say? Oh, the Sunnis and the Shias, the Sunnis and the Shias. You know, they're two different um, types of two different sections of Islam, factions of Islam, is how people generally explain it or see it. And we read by the Hasib that that's not 100% true for every faction of Shiaism, that certainly there are factions that are with mainstream Islam. But I just wanted to mention that in the beginning, the Shia was not even seen by anyone as a different religious faction, right? It was a political faction. It was more of a political movement. Over time, religious differences started to develop to where we have different sects to today. But originally, it was more of a political movement and not so much different religious factions. Brother Clemente, I see you have your hand up.
I just want to add to what you're saying because even as a Muslim, as being a revert, I run into some Shias before in Houston, but the question I always get from even Muslims today, I guess being a revert and not, I guess they're assuming, that I'm not a Muslim until I say something. They say, well, are you Shia? Are you Sunni? So even today, that's still used amongst um, the brotherhood, even within so-called quote unquote Sunni Islam, is you get the question, are you Sunni?
Right,
So
because for the most part, to this day, it's typically seen, and even though it's like I said, like Brother Hasib is not essentially 100% true, but it's typically seen as Shiites and Sunnis being two different factions of Islam. Of course, it's not as black and white as that, but I just thought it was important to mention that in the beginning, that was not even a discussion. Shiites were not even seen by anyone as a different religious faction. It was more of a political movement. So I just thought it was just kind of a fun fact for all of us to know in terms of how these differences between Sunni and Shias kind of first came to be, right? Well, then, inshallah ta'ala, let's go ahead and move on. So we were talking about how during the Umayyad dynasty, like I said, we're not going to go into vivid detail, a lot of corruption came to rise, a lot of political and social unrest came to rise, which caused a lot of division between the Muslim Ummah. And this also caused a lot of the companions and scholars to kind of disperse and go to different parts of the world to kind of distance themselves from the ruling caliph of that time. And due to this is where different schools of thought eventually started to develop. So as we discussed last week that the practice of individual ijtihad or independent, making independent rulings based off your own understanding of the Quran and Sunnah, this was a practice that some of the companions did when there was not a consensus, but at the same time, they would also make it very clear that whatever conclusion they would come into, it is not necessarily infallible. This is based off their own personal opinion, and they respected each other's personal opinions. But when these divisions started happening, and the scholars of that time were being forced to essentially migrate and go to different parts of the area, there was no longer that connection between the, sorry, there was a fly that just came flying to my face, but there's no longer the connection between, there was no longer that connection and that unity between these companions and the scholars. And so On top of that, the scholars would run into different cultural issues depending on the places that they would migrate to, which of course would cause them to have to practice more of ijtihad, independent rulings. They of course took on students, and those students would take their scholars' particular interpretation and rulings and essentially hold on to that. And I know I'm simplifying it, but the reason I'm kind of simplifying it is because I don't want to make it too difficult for anyone to hold on to. So due to the changing dynamic of the Islamic nation, the scholars of their times and in their areas had the need to practice Islam based off of their own individual understanding, because that connection, that unity was lost, right? And this was kind of like the first step towards the developing of the different madhabs, or the different schools of thought, was due to these issues, which is kind of just like a reminder for us of why it's so important for the Muslim Ummah, the Muslim nation, to be united. When we're united is when we are at our strongest, but when we become divided, these types of issues occur. Not that I'm calling, of course, a school of thought issue, but just a reflection of the history of that time, which forced the scholars to kind of disperse and hold their tongue in order to avoid these type of issues. And so the last thing we'll mention that this chapter mentions is kind of like the two, he basically calls like the first two different types of madhabs between the scholars of that particular time in the Umayyad dynasty, which is known as the people of hadith and the people of reason. So these were like kind of one of the earliest first two madhabs, or schools of thought at that time. And so the people of hadith, and we spoke about this a little briefly last week as well, the people of hadith were the scholars who would take a hadith, make rulings based off explicit events and situations mentioned in the Quran and hadith. But if there was situations that they could not explicitly find or be mentioned in Quran and hadith, they would typically leave it. They wouldn't touch it, right? These were people known as the people of hadith, because they relied heavily on explicitly what the hadith said and what the Quran said when it came to making rulings. And if that was not something that was found in Quran or hadith, they essentially would not even touch that issue. They say there's nothing to talk about. The people of reason, which is the other school of thought or madhab that he mentions here, these were individuals who would take it a little bit of a step further. So what I mean by that is they would use Quran and hadith that was available to them, but on top of that, they would also use their own individual reasoning to make particular rulings or decisions. And he mentions in the book here that one of the biggest factors for that is a lot of the scholars that are part of that particular school of thought, they were in parts of the Islamic nation at the time that were in areas that were had many different cultures and situations that the companions, the Sahaba, were used to, because this was when the Islamic nation was starting to expand to different areas. And so they went into, so there was a few things. One, there were not as many companions available in those areas, because as we know, most of the companions stayed, close to Mecca and Medina. So there weren't that many companions in those areas outside of outside of what was originally known in different cultures. And so that was number one. Number two, of course, is like I mentioned before, Islam was being introduced in different nations and different cultures that the companions were not really used to. So they ran into a lot of situations that were not explicitly mentioned in the hadith or the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, because of course they never ran into those issues. So they had to depend heavily on what limited resources they had and just kind of make their own deductive reasoning based on even hypothetical situations. And so these were one of the earliest two madhabs or schools of thought at that time. The people of the hadith, whom like we mentioned, were the scholars who would stick closely to what the Sunnah explicitly said, what the Quran explicitly said, and if any situation came to rise that was not really relevant to what resources they had, they would ignore. And then we have the people of reason who would come up with rulings even based off just hypothetical situations. They rely more on their own individual reasoning and logic. And so with that, I think we can stop there. So like I mentioned, this is a very, very short chapter, but also a lot to gain from it. And so with this, I would like to open the floor for any questions or comments, inshallah. Okay. Mr. Clemente.
And speaking of the different schools of thought, as far as today is concerned, I remember when I first met you, and the brothers and sisters of Embrace, I was introduced to a school of thought, a Maliki. You know, when the brothers after I took Shahada. So, with that said, today with the schools of thought, as reverts or those new to Islam, when it comes to school of thought, I was told you should pick one and stick to that one. But I've heard other ones like, well, it doesn't matter, just learn Islam and then it'll come later. So I hope I'm not getting off what we're talking about. I just know you mentioned different school of thoughts, and I was wondering.
Right. So again, let me just kind of emphasize that we're not going to be discussing in detail the different schools of thought. This is more of a history of how the schools of thought came to be, nor are we going to endorse any specific school of thought. That's not what this purpose of this Wednesday discussion is about, but it's instead for us as converts and as Muslims in general to develop and have an understanding of where these schools of thoughts came from. In order for us to understand that, it's okay to have different schools of thought. There's not one school of thought that's absolutely right and everything else, all of them is wrong. At the same time, understand that the schools of thought is a necessity, because you have two different extremists. You have one extreme where the school of this school of thought is like divinely ordained. It's absolutely the only correct way, and all the other ones are deviant, right? Which of course we know is absolutely incorrect. But you have people like that who won't even pray next to someone because, oh, well, they're praying like the Menachis, and that's not the way I do it, so I'm staying away from that person. That's absolutely wrong. Hence why we mentioned how the dangers of division. On the other hand, you have the other side that completely reject the notion of a school of thought. And they'll say, I'm just going to follow the Quran and Sunnah. I don't believe in the idea of a school of thought. Well, then your next question is, okay, but do you know how that Sunnah was collected? Do you know who's providing proper interpretation of the Quran and the Hadith? So you have to have a balance, right? And so in order for us to kind of achieve that balance, having an understanding of the history of the schools of thought can help us with that.
I understand, because that would have helped me if I would have had this this background, why when I took Shahada, then it would have helped me, but it's helping me now. I look at understanding um, where it came from, so that is helping me. But I understand that, not going into detail, but I understand what you're saying.
Absolutely. Are there any other questions or comments? And again, I apologize if I kind of was kind of rushing through it, or if I said something that was a little confusing. I just wanted to make sure that I didn't kind of go off the rails or make it a little bit too detailed or heavy that made it difficult for anyone to follow. So if there are any holes that I said, please do forgive me, and please ask any questions. If I said something that didn't make much sense or you didn't really understand, please feel free to ask questions or clarify something like what the Hasib did earlier.
I have just a few observations. Brother Kenneth, he described the two schools of what they call Ahl al-Hadith and Ahl al-Rai, people of Hadith and people of opinion. Now, when we say opinion, that does not mean that they have opinion that they don't hold random opinions. The people who were called the scholars in Fiqh of Rai, their opinion is based on the on Quran and Sunnah. So those are not don't get this idea that the one side they can come up with any opinion.
All right.
Generally,
We mentioned that the people of recent opinion, they did follow the,
yeah,
but they did not have as much access due to the areas that they were in than the other factions. So they had there was a lot more times where they would have to derive rulings based off their own opinions. But yes, they did derive opinions based off the Sunnah, absolutely. And I apologize if I was giving off the indication that they didn't rely on the Quran and Sunnah at all. That was not my intention. But Brother Hasib, you said you have a couple other observations you mentioned, or was that the main one?
this is the main one. Actually, I can give an example also. And someone asked this question. Imam Abu Hanifa is known as Al-Rai. And someone asked this interesting question. He said that we know that the let me see. Sorry, I think that's fine. But Brother Kenneth clarified that Rai, the people who are Rai, they will also have their opinion based on a solid foundation of the teaching of Quran and Sunnah. I think that's the only point.
Jazakallah khair. And again, Ahl Ra'a is the people of reason, for those who didn't catch that. Any other questions or comments? I know that what we're talking about is a little heavy, but at the same time, it's important. If there aren't any more questions or comments, we can go ahead and close a little early, inshallah. I'll give everyone just a few more seconds to say something, and if not, we'll just go ahead and close. My sister Amy, did you want to say something? I saw that you unmuted yourself. Okay, so inshallah, we will go ahead and close. Allahumma subhanahu wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Jazakumullah khairan, everyone, for joining us. Inshallah ta'ala, next week we'll go over section 4, which again, I don't think it's that long, but there still will be a lot for us to cover. Like I mentioned, you can buy this book off Amazon if you want to keep up, or I also attached a free PDF on the WhatsApp, so just let me know if you wanted to do it that way as well. Tonight we're going to be doing the thanks for the reminder, Brother Daniel. I wasn't going to forget. So tonight, inshallah, we're also going to be doing our second night of Quran Rush. For those of you who don't know, every single night throughout Ramadan, which started yesterday, that's going to continue throughout Ramadan, is every night we're going to be discussing major themes of each juz, each section of the Quran. And every night it'll be led by a different Embrace member. So it's not just going to be me or Sheikh Jassi, Sister Nahel. It'll be led by a variety of different brothers and sisters. And everyone is heavily encouraged to come. It's not just going to be a lecture, more of a conversation. And it's meant to be a very spiritually uplifting program. I know a lot of us are very upset and sad that we're not going to be able to pray Tarawih at the masjid or go to a class in the masjid during Ramadan. So with this program, inshallah, we can help each other stay connected with the Quran through discussing the different major themes of each juz, inshallah. It's going to be tonight throughout all of Ramadan, 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. Central Time, 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Time, and 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. All right, I think I got all of it. Am I missing anything, Mr. Daniel? Okay, all right, good. All right, guys, so inshallah ta'ala, hopefully I'll see all of you in an hour and 15 minutes for Quran Rush. Jazakumullahu khairan, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alex.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.